You've probably been in a situation where you did everything right. You put in the work, you showed up, you gave it everything, and somehow, the outcome still didn't match the effort. Someone else walked away with the result you worked for. And the frustrating part isn't just that it happened. It's that you couldn't figure out why. Because here's the uncomfortable part, effort was never the variable. You were just thinking inside a box that other people stopped using a long time ago. And that's exactly what this is about. Because at some point you'll realize that the people consistently getting the outcomes you want aren't working harder, they're operating from a completely different set of rules. We're going to talk about why making noise and showing your hand is quietly working against you. Then why every time you chose the quick win, you were actually trading something much bigger without realizing it. And then the one thing that looks like weakness from the outside, but is actually the most powerful move in the room. This is Book Echo, where we break down the ideas that actually change how you think, not just what you know. If that's what you're here for, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's coming next. There's a pattern you'll notice once you start paying attention to it. The people who talk the most about what they're doing are usually the ones who end up with the least to show for it. And it's easy to write that off as coincidence. But it isn't. When you announce your plans, your goals, your next move, you're not building momentum. You're doing something that feels like momentum. There's a difference. The announcement gives you a hit of validation before the work is done. People respond, they encourage you, they acknowledge the plan. And somewhere in that exchange, the brain registers a small version of the reward you were supposed to get at the finish line. Not the full version, but enough to quietly reduce the urgency to actually get there. But that's only part of the problem. The bigger issue is what happens on the other side of that conversation. Every time you reveal your position, what you want, what you're planning, what you're working toward, you hand the other person a map. They now know where you're going. And people, whether they mean to or not, respond to that information in ways that serve their own interests. A competitor adjusts. A colleague repositions. Someone who seems supportive starts asking questions that slow you down. None of it looks deliberate. Most of it probably isn't. But the result is the same, your path just got harder, and you're the one who made it harder. Think about the last time someone told you their plan before they executed it. Maybe it was a business idea, a career move, something they were building. And without even trying, your mind immediately started poking holes. Not because you wanted them to fail, just because that's what minds do when presented with incomplete information moving toward a future state. You start stress testing it. You raise concerns. You offer alternatives. And suddenly the person who came to you with momentum is leaving with doubt. That's what you're doing to yourself every time you open up too early. Strategic thinkers understand that information is leverage, and leverage only works when the other side doesn't have it. This isn't about being secretive for the sake of it. It's about understanding that the gap between where you are and where you're going is your most valuable asset while you're still in it. The moment you close that gap publicly, you've converted a strategic advantage into a social performance. And social performances get judged, critiqued, and interrupted in ways that real moves don't. There's a reason the most significant shifts, in business, in careers, in any competitive environment, tend to come from directions nobody saw coming. Not because the people behind them were hiding something sinister. But because they understood that a move announced is a move that can be countered. A move made quietly lands before anyone has had the chance to prepare a response. The noise isn't confidence. Most of the time, it's just exposure. Most people respond to what's visible. Someone says something, they react. A situation develops, they respond to the surface of it. And that's not a character flaw, it's just the default. When you're moving fast, you work with what's in front of you. But here's where it starts costing people without them realizing it. The visible part of any situation is almost never the whole story. What someone says out loud and what they actually want are two different things. What a room looks like on the surface and what's actually driving it are rarely the same. And if you're only ever responding to the surface, you're essentially making decisions with half the information. Strategic thinkers don't just observe what's happening. They observe what's happening and ask why. Not out loud, internally. They're running a quiet background process that most people around them aren't running. What does this person actually want from this interaction? What are they not saying? Why is this situation moving the way it is, and who benefits from it moving that way? It sounds like a lot. But it becomes automatic faster than you'd think, because most people are remarkably consistent. They have patterns. They have default behaviors they fall back on under pressure. They have things they always say when they're uncomfortable, moves they always make when they feel threatened, ways they signal what they want without ever directly asking for it. Once you start noticing those patterns, you stop being surprised by people. And when you stop being surprised, you stop reacting. You start anticipating. There's a specific skill inside this that most people never develop, the ability to read what someone isn't saying. Silence, hesitation, the way someone changes the subject, the things they respond to with unusual energy. These aren't random. They're signals. And in most conversations, the signals carry more information than the words do. Think about a negotiation, any kind, doesn't have to be formal. Two people sitting across from each other, both saying reasonable things. But one of them is watching the other's energy shift every time a specific number comes up. Watching where the hesitation is. Noticing what gets deflected versus what gets engaged with directly. That person isn't just in the conversation. They're reading it. And by the time an offer is made, they already have a rough map of where the other person's real boundary is, not the stated one, the actual one. That's the gap strategic thinking opens up. Not between smart people and less smart people. Between people who are fully inside the moment and people who are simultaneously inside it and slightly above it, watching it unfold with enough distance to see the pattern. The room is always giving you information. Most people are just too busy talking to notice it. There's a version of winning that feels good immediately and costs you later. And most people are so wired for the immediate version that they never notice the cost until it's already been paid. It shows up everywhere. The argument you won but damaged the relationship in the process. The quick opportunity you chased that pulled you off a path that was actually going somewhere. The time you pushed for a result too early because waiting felt uncomfortable, and watched the whole thing fall apart because it wasn't ready. Each of those moments felt like the right call in the moment. The problem is that the right call in the moment and the right call for your actual position are often two completely different things. The right now trap isn't about being impulsive. Most people who fall into it aren't impulsive, they're just optimizing for the wrong time frame. They're solving for today's discomfort instead of tomorrow's position. And that's a subtle distinction, but it changes every decision you make. Here's what strategic thinkers do differently. They carry a longer frame. Not in an abstract, philosophical way, in a practical one. Before making a move, there's a question running in the background: does this improve my position 6 months from now, or just right now? And when those two answers point in different directions, they're willing to absorb short-term friction to protect long-term positioning. That willingness to absorb friction is rarer than it sounds. Because short-term friction is real and immediate. The discomfort of not responding, not reacting, not taking the quick win, that's something you feel in the moment. The long-term benefit is abstract. It hasn't happened yet. And the human brain is not naturally built to weight an abstract future benefit over a concrete present discomfort. Which means playing the long game isn't just a strategy, it's a discipline. It requires you to repeatedly override a very natural impulse. The people who do it consistently aren't more patient by nature. They've just developed a clearer picture of what they're protecting. When you know exactly what you're building toward, short-term sacrifices stop feeling like losses. They start feeling like investments. The argument you didn't win becomes the relationship you kept intact. The quick opportunity you passed on becomes the focus that let you finish something that actually mattered. There's also something that happens to your reputation over time when you consistently play a longer game. People start to notice that you don't panic. That you don't chase. That when things get uncomfortable, you don't fold or rush. And that perception, of someone who moves deliberately and doesn't get rattled, is worth more in most environments than any single win you could have grabbed along the way. The right now trap is always going to be there. The question is whether you're building something worth protecting from it. Most people leave this completely to chance. They do the work, show up, perform, and assume that the results will speak for themselves. And in a fair, frictionless world, maybe they would. But that's not the environment most people are actually operating in. The environment most people operate in is one where perception moves faster than reality. Where someone's idea of who you are gets formed before you've had the chance to demonstrate who you are. Where the story about you, your competence, your intentions, your value, is being written constantly, by people who are working with incomplete information, filtered through their own interests and assumptions. And if you're not involved in that process, you're not protected from it. This isn't about spin. It's not about managing impressions in some calculated, performative way. It's about understanding that every interaction you have is also a data point that people use to build a model of you. And most people are unconsciously feeding that model in ways that don't serve them. Think about someone who always says yes. Who takes on everything, delivers consistently, never pushes back. From the outside that looks like reliability. But the story it tells over time is a different one, that this person is available, manageable, not someone who sets terms. And eventually the opportunities that come their way start reflecting that story. Not because people are malicious. Just because the narrative got set, and now it's operating on its own. Strategic thinkers understand that the narrative is always being written. The question is whether you're one of the authors or just a character someone else is writing. And being an author doesn't mean being loud about it. Remember, we already established that noise is exposure. It means being deliberate about the signals you send. What you agree to and what you don't. How you respond under pressure. What you're associated with. What you let pass and what you push back on. There's a specific moment where this matters more than any other, and that's early. The narrative that forms about you in the first few months of any environment, any relationship, any role, is extraordinarily sticky. People form impressions quickly and update them slowly. Which means the window where you have the most influence over how you're perceived is right at the beginning, before the story has solidified. Most people waste that window by just trying to survive the newness of a situation. Strategic thinkers use it deliberately. And here's the part that connects back to everything before this. The long game only works if the narrative supports it. You can be making all the right moves, reading situations correctly, staying quiet when others would make noise, but if the story people have about you doesn't match what you're actually building, the results won't land the way they should. The narrative isn't separate from the strategy. It's part of it. Who you're known to be determines what you're given access to. Everything we've covered so far has been about how you move. But there's a dimension of strategic thinking that doesn't get talked about nearly enough, and that's the decision not to move at all. Most people are uncomfortable with inaction. There's a pressure, mostly internal, that says doing something is always better than doing nothing. That stillness looks like passivity. That if something is happening around you and you're not responding, you're losing ground. And that pressure is responsible for more self-inflicted damage than almost any other instinct people carry. Because not every situation requires a response. Not every provocation deserves a reaction. Not every open door is worth walking through. And the inability to sit with that, to hold your position while everything around you is pulling for a reaction, is one of the most expensive habits a person can have. Here's what actually happens when you react to everything. You become predictable. And predictable people are easy to manage. If someone knows that a certain type of comment will get a rise out of you, they have a lever. If everyone around you knows that you'll jump at every opportunity that presents itself, they can control your attention simply by presenting opportunities. Reactivity isn't just emotionally costly, it's a strategic liability for exactly the reason we talked about in the first topic. It hands other people information about how you work. Strategic thinkers treat restraint as a move. Not a passive one, an active one. The decision not to respond to a provocation is a decision. The choice to let an opportunity pass because the timing isn't right is a choice. Holding your position when the pressure is to move is an exercise of control, not an absence of it. And when it's done consistently, it sends a signal that's very hard to fake, that you're operating from a place of security rather than urgency. There's also something that happens internally when you develop this capacity. The situations that used to feel urgent start feeling more manageable. Not because they've changed, because your relationship to them has. When you're not compelled to react, you have space to actually assess. An assessment almost always produces better outcomes than reaction does. The hardest version of this is when the pressure to act is coming from people you respect. When someone you trust is telling you to move, to respond, to take the shot. And everything in you wants to defer to that, because they're experienced, because they care about your outcome, because maybe they're right. But strategic thinking requires you to hold your own read of the situation even under that kind of pressure. Not arrogantly. Just clearly. Because nobody else is living inside your position with full information about what you're building and what you're protecting. Restraint isn't hesitation. Hesitation comes from not knowing what to do. Restraint comes from knowing exactly what you're doing, and choosing not to do it yet. There's a version of this idea that gets overcomplicated. People hear, thinking several moves ahead, and picture a chess grandmaster running 17 scenarios simultaneously before touching a piece. And that image is intimidating enough that most people never develop the habit at all, because it sounds like a cognitive level they don't have access to. But that's not what this actually is. The real version is much simpler. And much more available than most people realize. It starts with one question. If I do this, what happens next? Not what do I hope happens, not what should happen, what will actually happen, given what I know about the people involved and the environment I'm operating in. Just that one question, asked honestly, before a move is made. Most people never ask it. They see an action and they take it. They see an opening and they move through it. The gap between impulse and execution is almost zero. Strategic thinkers stretch that gap. Not dramatically, even a few seconds of genuine forward projection changes the quality of a decision. You take the action you are going to take, you run it forward honestly, and sometimes what you find is that the second step is fine but the third step lands somewhere you don't want to be. And now you know that before you've committed to anything. The reason most people don't do this isn't lack of intelligence. It's that forward projection requires you to be honest about outcomes you'd rather not think about. If you ask, what happens next, and the honest answer is uncomfortable, that the person won't respond the way you're hoping, that the opportunity has a catch you've been avoiding, that the move positions you worse than where you started, most people find a way to not fully register that answer. They ask the question and then talk themselves out of the uncomfortable answer before it has a chance to change their behavior. Strategic thinkers don't have a higher tolerance for discomfort. They've just learned to treat the uncomfortable answer as the valuable one. The scenario that makes you want to look away is almost always the one most worth examining. Because if you can see it coming and prepare for it, it stops being a threat and becomes a variable you're already accounting for. There's a practical way to build this. After any significant decision, track what actually happened, not just the immediate result, but 2 and 3 steps out. Most people only evaluate decisions at the first outcome. Did it work or didn't it? But the pattern you're trying to build is longer than that. Over time, if you're paying attention, you start to develop a much more accurate model of how situations actually unfold versus how you initially expect them to. And that model is what makes the forward projection faster and more reliable. You don't need to see every move. You just need to see further than the person across from you. Every person you interact with has a model of you. A set of assumptions about how you think, how you'll respond, what you're capable of, what you want. They built that model from limited information, a few interactions, second-hand impressions, surface-level observations. And they act on that model as if it's accurate. Most people spend enormous energy trying to correct those assumptions. Proving people wrong, demonstrating capability, pushing back against being underestimated. And that instinct is understandable, it feels like the right response to being misread. But strategic thinkers see it completely differently. They see a misread as an asset. Here's why. When someone has an inaccurate model of you, they're making decisions based on information that doesn't reflect reality. They're predicting your behavior from a version of you that doesn't exist. And that gap, between what they expect and what you're actually capable of, is one of the most powerful positions you can operate from. Because as long as they're working from the wrong map, every move you make lands somewhere they didn't account for. This doesn't require deception. It doesn't require you to perform a false version of yourself. It just requires you to stop correcting assumptions that are working in your favor. Let them underestimate the timeline. Let them assume you haven't thought that far ahead. Let them believe the situation is more settled than it is. You're not lying, you're just not volunteering information that would close a gap that's currently helping you. There's a specific version of this that shows up constantly in competitive environments. Someone gets written off early, too quiet, too measured, not aggressive enough to be a real player. And instead of fighting that perception, they use it. They move without drawing attention. They build without announcing. They position without signaling. And by the time the people who underestimated them realize what's actually been happening, the moves have already been made. The outcome is already in motion. There's nothing left to counter. The reason this works isn't psychological cleverness. It's structural. When people think they know what you're going to do, they stop watching as carefully. Attention is a resource, and people allocate it based on perceived threat level. Stay below that threshold long enough and you get something genuinely rare in competitive environments, the ability to operate without friction. No one repositioning against you. No one raising concerns about your trajectory. Just clean, unobstructed movement toward wherever you're actually going. What makes this the most advanced idea in this entire video is that it requires everything that came before it. You have to control information so the right assumptions form. You have to read the room to know which assumptions are operating. You have to play a long enough game that the gap has time to matter. You have to know when not to act so you don't close the gap prematurely. And you have to see far enough ahead to know exactly when to let reality correct the assumption, on your terms, at your timing. That's not a trick. That's a complete system. If you've made it this far, you're already ahead of most people. And if you've been following everything up to this point, you might have noticed something. Every topic we covered, staying quiet, reading situations, playing the long game, controlling your narrative, knowing when not to act, projecting forward, using assumptions as leverage, all of it requires one underlying capacity. Without it, none of the other ideas fully work. With it, all of them become significantly easier. That capacity is deliberate observation. Not passive observation. Not just paying attention in a general sense. Deliberate observation, the conscious, practiced habit of watching more than you speak, listening more than you respond, and extracting more signal from every interaction than anyone else in the room realizes is available. Most people move through their days in a kind of managed autopilot. They're present enough to function, reactive enough to respond, but not truly watching. Not watching what's actually happening beneath the surface of conversations. Not noticing how the energy in a room shifts when a specific topic comes up. Not tracking the gap between what people say and how they behave 3 days later. That information is there. It's always there. Most people just aren't collecting it. Deliberate observation is the practice of collecting it. Intentionally. Consistently. Not in an obsessive or paranoid way, in a quiet, disciplined way that becomes so natural over time that it stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like clarity. Here's how it works in practice. You enter any interaction with a simple internal commitment, to understand more than you express. Not to be silent for the sake of it, not to withhold unnecessarily, but to default to receiving information before transmitting it. Most people do the opposite. They arrive at conversations ready to speak, ready to contribute, ready to be heard. And in doing so, they close off the channel that would give them the most useful information about the situation they're actually in. When you flip that default, when receiving becomes the first instinct and speaking becomes the considered second, you start noticing things that were always there but invisible to you before. The person who always deflects a specific type of question. The dynamic in a room that shifts every time a certain person speaks. The pattern in someone's decision-making that only becomes visible when you're watching across multiple interactions instead of just responding to each one in isolation. And here's what that does for everything else. It makes reading the room automatic. It feeds your forward projection with accurate data instead of assumptions. It shows you which narratives are forming before they solidify. It tells you when restraint is the right move because you can see what reaction would actually produce. It reveals which assumptions people are carrying about you, and whether those assumptions are worth correcting or worth keeping. Deliberate observation is the foundation the entire system runs on. The other ideas are the moves. This is what makes the moves possible. Start small. One conversation today where your only goal is to understand more than you express. Not forever, just once. Notice what you pick up that you would have missed if you'd been focused on what you were about to say next. That's the beginning of thinking strategically. Not a framework, not a set of rules, just a shift in where your attention goes first. So here's what all of this actually comes down to. The loudest person in the room is usually the most exposed, because noise is just another word for information you're handing to people who can use it against you. Reading situations means looking past what's visible and asking what's actually driving what you're seeing. Playing the long game means being willing to absorb short-term friction to protect something worth protecting. Your narrative is always being written, the only question is how much of a hand you have in writing it. Restraint isn't passivity, it's control. Seeing ahead isn't a talent, it's a habit of asking one honest question before you move. And the assumptions people carry about you aren't obstacles, they're openings, if you know how to use them. All of it runs on the same foundation. Watch more than you speak. Receive before you transmit. The information you need to make better moves is almost always already in the room, most people are just too busy performing to notice it. Here's the only thing worth trying before you sleep tonight. Pick one conversation from today, one you already had. And ask yourself honestly, how much of it were you actually watching, versus how much were you just waiting for your turn to speak? That answer will tell you exactly where to start. And if this way of thinking resonates with you, the quieter, more deliberate approach to how you move through situations, there's a natural next step to this. Because everything we talked about today assumes one thing, that when you're in a situation, your mind is actually working for you and not against you. That you're thinking clearly instead of getting pulled into the noise of what's going wrong. And that's harder than it sounds. Because the default for most people isn't solution-oriented thinking, it's problem-oriented thinking. The mind locks onto what's broken, what's missing, what went wrong. And without realizing it, that becomes the lens everything else gets filtered through. The next video is about breaking that pattern. Training your mind to move towards solutions automatically, not as a motivational habit, but as a genuine cognitive shift that changes the quality of every decision you make. If you've been watching this channel and this is the kind of thinking you want more of, subscribing just means the next piece is there when you're ready for it. No pressure, just a continuation of the same thread. The next step is already there. Whether you take it is up to you.